Hello everybody and welcome to this brief video over the origins of attitudes. So, where do our evaluations of attitude objects come from? Well, they come from a lot of different places. One possible source is our genetic makeup. So our genes code for proteins like those used to construct our neurotransmitters and the very structure of our brain. Now, our brain is very plastic. It's constantly changing. But the genetic programs that we have dictate certain things about neurotransmitter levels, hormone levels, neural structure. And by controlling these aspects of neural architecture, it's been proposed that one source of attitudes are our genes. So certain things that are fairly inborn, like our temperament, right? These may bias us to react to certain attitude objects in certain ways. So those reactions may then generate attitudes. So, those of us who are a little bit easier in our temperament, we may have very, very different attitudes than might those who are have more of a difficult temperament or even slow to warm up. All right. So it's been proposed that by shaping our brains, our genes can kind of, not directly, but kind of in a roundabout way, guide what attitudes we ultimately develop. And certainly we see that within families, attitudes are fairly consistent. And we find that attitudes are fairly consistent among among monozygotic twins, so twins who are the closest thing to natural clones. All right. So these would be identical twins. But it's not like we inherit an attitude. All right. So and that's never been proposed. We don't inherit an attitude. All right. Instead, we inherit our genes, which code for the proteins and the development of our neural structure, and those bias us to develop certain attitudes. All right. But that doesn't guarantee it. All right. Biology is far less deterministic. It's far less, this is going to happen, than a lot of people treat it to be. All right. Now, not only can our genes affect what attitudes we develop, our experiences develop what attitudes or influence what attitudes we develop. And our experiences probably play one of the bigger parts in what attitudes we develop. Now, we have a whole variety of experiences. Obviously, we have many different experiences. But we can kind of categorize those experiences into affective experiences, cognitive experiences, and behavioral experiences. So let's talk about affective experiences. So a whole host of affective experiences can guide what attitudes we develop. For example, certain things are just pretty to us. All right. We have certain sensory experiences that are pleasant, right? So although I know it's not true of a lot of people, for me, the taste of coffee, love it, yum. All right. No cream or nothing, just I like the flavor. So much so that when I had to jump off caffeine, I started drinking decaf coffee. All right, but pictures, paintings, landscapes, different things can have trigger aesthetic responses that are pleasant, or sensory experiences that are pleasant. Pizza, love pizza. I've said it in other videos, many other videos, I think. All right, because of a positive sensory experience that I've had. All right. So these affective experiences can trigger attitudes. So because of my positive sensory experience with pizza, I have a positive attitude towards pizza. All right. Because those aesthetic reactions, because I really like, those I forget the artist. Art is not my forte. but it has like the melted clock on the side. Those kinds of paintings, I have a positive aesthetic reaction to those. So I have a positive attitude towards it. You know, those those paintings that are very uniform in their shape, but they have kind of illusions to them. So impossible figures, those, I have a positive aesthetic reaction to those. All right. So those positive aesthetic reactions, those positive sensory reactions lead to positive attitudes. Those are affective experiences, emotional experiences leading to attitudes, leading to an evaluation. We also have experiences such as we can also develop attitudes from from affective experiences, such as those we experience when we experience conditioning. So, you know, there's classical conditioning, there's operant conditioning, right? Classical conditioning is when we associate, you know, a stimulus that we already had an automatic reaction to, like food, right? I have automatic positive reaction to it when we associate that stimulus with some neutral stimulus, right? So in the, you know, classic Pavlov's dog, right? The dog has a positive evaluation to the food. The bell, it didn't originally have a positive reaction to the bell, but because the bell was paired with the food, eventually the bell caused the positive reaction by itself. That's classical conditioning. When classical conditioning happens in humans, right, we can then develop attitudes towards those previously neutral stimuli after classical conditioning. Operant conditioning, right? So we have some behavior, and then it has some consequences in that. And that consequence can be a positive or negative reinforcer or a positive or negative punisher. According to the law of effect, if that consequence is satisfying, it strengthens the relationship between whatever preceded the behavior and the behavior. All right, so it strengthens the relationship between an antecedent to the behavior and the behavior. So, you know, I might have done something, and then somebody gave me a consequence, and that behavior, if they gave me a positive or negative reinforcer, then the chances of me continuing the behavior go up, right? And that can lead to a positive attitude, right? If I've been positively or negatively reinforced to do something, then my attitude towards whatever the antecedent is probably is going to become more positive. If I've been positively or negatively punished for interacting with something, then my attitude towards that antecedent is probably going to become more negative. All right. And this is actually, although I don't think anybody necessarily plans to, but there's a type of operant conditioning called instrumental conditioning. This is when people essentially reinforce or punish people for things that they want them to continue doing or things that they don't want them to continue doing. So sometimes our families or our friends can instrumentally condition what attitudes we have by reinforcing or punishing us for doing them, right? So if they like what we're doing, they may reinforce us either positively or negatively, leading us to develop a positive attitude towards that behavior, all right? But if they don't like what we're doing, they don't like that's something we've said, they may punish us positively or negatively, and that may lead us to develop more of a negative attitude towards it. All right. So this affective experience of conditioning with classical and operant can lead us to develop positive and negative attitudes. Another affective experience that can lead us to develop positive attitudes is simple exposure. And this is known as the mere exposure effect. All right. And this is a fairly classic effect now. It's called, it was discovered by science, right? So the mere exposure effect was discovered by science. And the mere exposure effect simply refers to the phenomena whereby we develop more positive evaluations of things that we've been exposed to in the past. Simple exposure, mere exposure to a thing tends to lead people to develop positive attitudes towards that thing, even when they're not aware that they've been exposed. So for example, in one study, Zients and colleagues subtly, subliminally presented people with either polygons or Chinese ideographs, and they made sure nobody spoke Chinese or read Chinese. Then, after being subliminally shown those images, so again, subliminally, they weren't aware of having seen those images. They were then shown the same images, similar images, or different images. And the participants were then asked to evaluate the images that they had seen before, but weren't aware that they had seen, similar images, or different images. And what they found is that people, after having been exposed to Chinese ideographs, compared to those who were subliminally shown polygons, rated their attitudes towards the Chinese ideographs that they had seen and similar Chinese ideographs more positively than dissimilar Chinese ideographs or polygons. And the exact opposite was true in the condition where they had been subliminally shown polygons. So people who had been subliminally shown polygons, they had more positive attitudes towards polygons they had seen, polygons that were similar to those that they had seen, than to Chinese ideographs. All right. So even when we're not aware of having been exposed to something, simple exposure, mere exposure, leads to more positive attitudes. And this is thought to be through the avenue of familiarity. Being exposed to something makes us feel more familiar with the thing, and that greater sense of familiarity leads us to have more positive attitudes. All right. So a whole host of affective experiences can lead us to develop attitudes. All right. But also cognitive experiences can lead us to develop attitudes. We may encounter information about something, and that information, if it implies something good, so let's say you hear about a person for the first time, right? And everything that you hear about that person is good, right? Well, chances are that information alone is going to lead you to develop a positive attitude towards that person, okay? But let's imagine instead, you never heard anything about this person before, and all you hear are bad things. Then chances are that information is going to lead you to develop a negative attitude towards that person. All right. So in this case, the information, the thoughts you're having, the information you have about a person, it could be anything, not just a person. Just in this example, it's a person. The negative information you have about the attitude object leads to a positive or negative attitude. So those are cognitive origins. And it's fairly straightforward, fairly simple, just like that. All right. If you have positive information about something, you develop a positive attitude. If you have negative information about something, you develop a negative attitude. That's a cognitive attitude. Then you can also have a behavioral attitude. And these behavioral attitudes are, I was about to say they're the less frequent, but honestly, I can't say how frequent they are. Behavioral attitudes are simply those that we develop upon reflecting on how we've behaved towards an attitude object. So let's say somebody asks you, whether you like hamburgers. All right. Well, you may have never thought, right, about how much you like hamburgers. Just when they were served, you ate them. If they weren't served, it's not like you went out and got them. All right. You never thought about the attitude you had. But then somebody asked you, all right, well, hey, do you like hamburgers? Then you have to reflect on it. Now, BIM's self-perception theory argues that we can sometimes develop attitudes by reflecting on how we've behaved towards the attitude object in the past. So in this example, if you weren't aware of any attitude you had towards hamburgers, and then somebody asked you, hey, do you like hamburgers? Then according to BIM's self-perception theory, you're going to reflect on the past instances that you can remember in which you've done something with hamburgers. So, when people asked you whether you wanted a hamburger, did you say yes? Did you always say yes? Did you say yes to every kind of hamburger? All right, so BIM says that you're going to look back on how you interacted with these hamburgers in the past and then infer your attitude from those events. And so if every time you were offered a hamburger, you said yes. If it didn't matter what kind of hamburger you were offered, you said yes, then you probably would infer, well, I must have a decently positive attitude towards hamburgers, right? So those are your three origins of attitudes: affective experiences, or at least your three origins from experience: affective experiences, cognitive experiences, and behavioral experiences. Now, an attitude can be based on any one of these. Usually, most of our attitudes have a affective component, meaning there's some felt experience, a cognitive component, meaning there's something we think about the attitude, and a behavioral component, meaning we have memory of how we behaved, and there's a typical way that we behave towards an attitude object. And so usually attitudes have all three, but sometimes an attitude can be primarily based on one of the three kinds of experiences. And whether it's based on affective experiences, cognitive experiences, or behavioral experiences has consequences. So I've talked in other videos about attitude strength, right? How strong they are, how influential they are, how hard they are, how easy an attitude is to be changed. If an attitude is strong, then it's not very easy to change. It's going to be very influential on your behavior. You're probably going to behave consistent with that attitude frequently. And you're probably going to have that same attitude a year and 5 years from now, if it's strong. If the attitude is weak, then you're probably not going to have the same attitude a year or 5 years or 10 years from now. If the attitude is weak, it's probably going to be fairly easy to change. So whether your attitudes have an affective, cognitive, or behavioral base can dictate how strong the attitude is. So affective attitudes tend to be stronger, all right? Some additional affective sources can be your beliefs and your values, such as religious beliefs or political beliefs, all right? These affective attitudes tend to be the strongest and the hardest to change. Cognitive attitudes can be changed more easily by strong arguments, all right? Affective attitudes, not so much. Cognitive attitudes, they can be changed, but the more you think about an attitude, the stronger it becomes. Behavioral attitudes tend to be the weakest, all right? They tend to be the weakest of all three kinds. Because they simply reflect a guess on your part. You know, I think I like them, and you're just basing it on what you can remember about the way you've interacted with the attitude object in the past. So your behaviorally based attitudes are the weakest. Cognitively based attitudes can be pretty strong if you've thought about it a lot, but your affectively based attitudes tend to be the strongest. All right, guys, that is it for this video about the bases of attitudes. We talked about genetic bases, experiential bases, including affective, cognitive, and behavioral. And then we've talked about the consequences of attitudes that are based primarily on one of those three types of experiences. All right, guys, that's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, send them my way. Otherwise, take it easy.